It is our great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, who is admired and respected by millions in Iran and abroad. Member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, chair of NCRI's Athletics Committee. A man who has not only won 17 gold, silver, and bronze medals for Iran in international competitions, but whose humility and his defense of the rights of the Iranian people has earned him the title of National Hero of Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pahlevan Muslim Iskandar Filavi.
خسته شدیم اینقدر انگلیسی صحبت کردن. اقلا زبان فارسی ما صحبت کنیم. درود بر تک تک شما ایرانیان میهن پرست که به واقع پرچم ایران رو در این سالها استوار نگه داشتیم. شما هواداران سازمان مجاهدین خلق ایران در این 39 سال گذشته پرچم کاویانی رو همیشه رو سرتون نگه داشتید و افتخار کردید. درود بر شما، درود بر تک تکتون، برای اینکه این کشور ما رو یک رژیمی به غارت گرفته است، یعنی به گروگان گرفته. مردم ما رو میکشه، زندان میکنه، پولهای مملکت ما رو دزدیده و داره خیانتهایی میکنه به ناموس و جان و مال مردم ایران. در این 39 سال شما بودید که تحت رهبری مسعود و مریم در تمام دنیا قیام کردید و کوتاه نیامدید. استعمار و ارتجاع هر دو با هم خواستن ما رو داغون کنن، ولی تک تک شما به علت این که اون هسته اصلی این مقاومت یعنی مجاهدین و شورای ملی مقاومت محکم بودن، به خاطر رهبری محکمشون ایستادید و دنیا تسلیم شده. حالا میبینید که در ایران شما هستید که صداتون مردم میشنون. ما با مردم ایران واقعا همصدا هستیم و این حکومت از بین میره. رژیم ایران دیگه در دنیا جایی نداره.
Our next speaker is also a member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. He is Iran's beloved champion, revered first and foremost for his modesty. A world champion who made Iran proud in international wrestling competitions, who won gold, silver, and bronze medals in world championships. Please welcome Dr. Mohammad Qurbani.
ممنون و متشکر. خواستم با درود به شما و هموطنان عزیز در ایران و همچنین درود بر مردم ایران که با قیام خود لرزه بر پشت این رژیم خونخوار و جنایتکار آوردند. همچنین درود به شهدای قیام و عرض تسلیت به خانواده شهدا و ابراز همدردی با آن کسانی که در حال حاضر در سیاهچالهای این رژیم قرون وسطایی ضد ایران و ضد ایرانی در زیر سخت‌ترین شکنجه و سرکوب قرار دارند. همچنین درود من به زنان و جوانان غیور ایران که رسم و رسوم عیاری و سنت پهلوانی را در خود گرفته و از در مقابل این حکام ظالم به پا خواستند و با دست در دست هم و همت مردم ایران دوران سیاه آخوندها را پایان دهیم و آزادی و دموکراسی را در یک ایران آزاد و آباد برقرار کنیم. زنده باد آزادی، پاینده باد ارتش آزادی بخش. پیروز باشید. زنده باشید.
با تشکر از دکتر قربانی. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghorbani. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the leaders and representatives of the Iranian American communities presenting the convention resolution adopted by the delegates. The resolution will be delivered by Dr. Homaira Hassami from Texas and Mr. Mehdi Qaimi from Colorado.
And the states represented: Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Wisconsin.
The resolution of 2018 Iran Freedom Convention for Human Rights and Democracy. We call on the international community, especially the United States, to express solidarity with the Iran Freedom Convention to be held in Paris on June 30th, 2018, which reflects the true desire of the Iranian people for regime change. Our findings, whereas the century-long struggle for freedom and democracy, independence, and popular sovereignty in Iran has continued despite the mullah's absolute repression. Whereas since 1981, some 120,000 dissidents, majority of them members and supporters of People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, the opposition movement, have been executed and hundreds of thousands arrested and imprisoned. Whereas since 1979, women, youth, religious, and ethnic minorities have been especially targeted by the regime's suppression. Whereas this regime has brought Iranian people nothing but poverty, social hardship, denial of their most basic rights. Whereas since 1979, the ruling theocracy has embarked on hostage-taking, warmongering, committing and sponsoring terrorism in Middle East and beyond to stifle the freedom movement at home and export fundamentalism abroad. Whereas the regime's clandestine nuclear weapon program, exposed by MEK Network since 1991, aims at furthering the theocratic regime's expansionist and destabilizing agenda. Whereas the international community policy towards Iran, based on the fantasy of modernization through appeasement and engagement, has had catastrophic consequences for the people of Iran, threatening the regional and global peace and security, and spreading terrorism to US and Europe. Whereas the uprising that started in late December 2017 and rapidly expanded to more than 140 cities has been embodiment of the nearly 4 decades of Iran's freedom movement, which will undoubtedly culminate the fall of the tyrannical regime in Iran. Whereas the protesters across Iran declaring reformists, hardliners, the game is now over, death to dictator, death to Khamenei, death to Rouhani, and we will die, but we will get our Iran back, are definitively expressing their desire for regime change. Whereas 2-decade-long political and diplomatic rows of moderate faction within the interestingly and structurally irreformable Velayat Faqih regime is now completely debunked. Whereas more than 50 peaceful protesters have been murdered in the streets or later in prisons under torture, with more than 8,000 arrested and imprisoned during the uprising. Whereas members of US Congress overwhelmingly supported the protesters' call for change. Whereas, as acknowledged by Ali Khamenei, Hassan Rouhani, and top security intelligence officials, the MEK social network in Iran, cities played a key role in expansion, direction, and organization of uprising and ensuing the protests. Whereas the National Council of Resistance, NCRI, led by Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, played a central role in conveying the core demand of the Iranian people to the international community. Whereas since January, despite the suppressive measures, anti-government protests have continued with slogans such as, "The enemy is here, they are lying, it is America." Whereas protesters, workers, farmers, teachers, youth, women, religious and ethnic minorities, or just ordinary Iranians, have escalated and intensified in cities throughout Iran, including Ahvaz, Kazerun, Esfahan, and several Kurdish cities. Whereas the Iranian people are opposed to foreign military intervention as much as it abhors the appeasement of the mullahs ruling in Iran. Whereas in July 2015, following the signing of JCPOA, Mrs. Mariam Rajavi underscored that the deal had provided unwarranted concession to the mullahs regime, that evicting the regime from Middle East and preventing its regional meddling is a fundamental principle that needs to be included in any agreement, and that any agreement that disregards the fails underscores the Iranian people's human rights will only embolden the regime in its suppression, relentless execution, and abuse of the rights of the Iranian people.
Now, therefore, be it resolved that 2018 Iran Freedom Convention for Human Rights and Democracy, 1, wholeheartedly supports the Iranian people's nationwide uprising and a democratic, secular, and non-nuclear republic for the post-Ayatollah's Iran. 2, strongly condemns the continued gross human rights violations in Iran, especially the barbaric crackdown on anti-government protests and murderous treatment of detained protesters, particularly women. 3, views the MEK views the MEK's exposure of the Iranian regime's clandestine nuclear program as a patriotic undertaking which has significantly contributed to world peace. 4, supports the NCRI's plans and programs as the sole democratic alternative to the ruling mullahs, in particular its plan of action for transfer of power to the people within 6 months after the regime's overthrow, and Mrs. Mariam Rajavi's 10-point plan for the future of Iran. 5, supports the open invitation by Iranian resistance leader Mr. Masoud Rajavi to all Iranian groups and individuals who seek a democratic and secular republic to cooperate in the framework of the National Solidarity Front. 6, supports regime change by Iranians and the organized opposition and rejects the appeasement policy towards the Iranian regime. 7, urges the United Nations to take up the regime's appalling human rights dossier, hold the perpetrators of human rights violations, particularly those responsible for the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, accountable by adopting concrete and punitive measures. 8, demands the immediate release of political prisoners, including those arrested in recent protests, and calls on the world community to do the same and take measures, including targeted sanctions, against those regimes, agencies, and officials responsible for the crackdown. 9, calls on the international community to support and empower the Iranian people by providing them with the internet and communication technology to bypass regime's homegrown internet and malicious messaging apps exclusively developed to expand the cyber suppression of the movement. 10, calls on the United States to formulate and implement a policy in support of democratic, secular, and non-nuclear republic in Iran, and to recognize the NCRI as a viable democratic political alternative coalition. And 11, calls for exposing the Iranian regime's political proxies in the US and their efforts to portray the adoption of a firm policy vis-à-vis the Tehran regime as waging war, and for directing law enforcement agencies to investigate the legality of their activities in the United States. Thank you.